You know, some of you may know my wife grew up down in Huntington Beach. We would go down there. We still go down there quite often. We're just down there this past week visiting her family. But several years ago, I was down in Huntington Beach, and in my family, I'm the one that kind of gets up early. I don't know, some of you all maybe are early people, some of you aren't. I like to get up early, and our kids were still young, and so whenever we were down south, I'd always get up early. I'd leave my mother and father-in-law's house, and I would go to a coffee shop, and I'd read the paper when the paper was still made of paper. It was this amazing thing. And there was one day in particular, I'm down at a Starbucks near the pier of Huntington Beach. It's so great. Even my stories when I leave town are at coffee shops. It's kind of all I do. And I'm down there, and as I'm drinking a cup of coffee, reading the paper, all of a sudden this person comes in, and there's this older gentleman in a table sort of near me, and the person comes in and super excited and goes up to this person and asks for their autograph. And I'm thinking, this is crazy. This is so odd. And I watched the person kind of sign something. They scurried out. And then I turned to this person. And I'm looking at the person. And I'm like, I got nothing. So I said, hey, that was really interesting. The person kind of asking for your autograph. I'm sorry. I don't know who you are, though. Like, who are you? And he looks at me and he goes, oh, I'm no one. Everyone just thinks I'm Tommy Lasorda because I look like him. But sometimes it's just easier to sign the paper. I'm like, that is the greatest. So I've got a Tommy Lasorda autograph if you want one. But that idea of mistaken identity, sometimes people are who we think they are. Sometimes, though, people are right in front of us and we can't recognize who they are. We don't know who they are. And that's more the mistaken identity we have in our passage from Luke's gospel that we're about to get into. We just heard the Easter story, those first 12 verses. And we're going to pick up in verse 13. And Cleopas is the person we're going to read about, and his companion are making their way to Emmaus. And they're ultimately going to have this interaction and not recognize that Jesus is the one that they're having this interaction with. And so, as we've heard that first part of the story, let's continue in the Easter story as Luke tells it, beginning and picking it up in verse 13. Now, on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened about that Easter morning. And while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, what are you discussing with each other while you walk along? And they stood still, looking sad. And then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these days? And Jesus asked, what things? And so they began to explain what had unfolded that week and that Easter morning. And then they went on to say, some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. And then Jesus said to them, oh, how foolish you are and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. And then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. And as they came near to the village to which they were going, Jesus walked ahead as if he were going on, but they urged him strongly, saying, stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is almost over. And so Jesus went in to stay with them, and when he was at the table with them, he took bread, he broke the bread and gave it to them, and then their eyes were opened, and they recognized Jesus. And then he vanished from their sight. And they said to each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road and while he was opening the scriptures to us? It's just this amazing story. It would be a difficult sermon to preach, to explain it all, to make sense of it all. The Easter story is just this fantastic thing. And most of us are familiar with the story. We may be more familiar with Matthew or Mark or Luke's or John's version of the story. Some of us sort of conflate all of them into one story. And whatever it is, we know that whichever gospel we read, whichever story we encounter, it's filled with people who just don't get it all the time. They just oftentimes don't get what's going on. They're confused and they're closed to what God is doing, and sometimes closed to what God is doing when it's right in front of them. right? In Luke 24, we read that Mary and Joanna and James's mother Mary goes to the tomb, and they're perplexed by what they see, and they don't really understand what they see, but they come back to the apostles and they tell them what's happened, and the apostles believe that it's an idle tale and they don't believe them. Cleopas here with his companion sort of not recognizing Jesus when he's with Jesus, walking. How does that work? Right? They're having a conversation, then they're having a meal. I love this part where Jesus is explaining to him the scriptures about himself. Hey, this me here I'm talking about. I mean, it's just this amazing story. And when we come to this, so oftentimes what we need to recognize is the point is, of course, that Easter has burst into our world, the world of space and time and matter and real history and real people and real life. And whenever that happens, our minds and our imaginations all too often are too small to comprehend it. It's just so much to try to process. And so we do our best to put the ocean in a bottle, so to speak, and fit these explosive facts, the idea of the resurrection, into possibilities that we can understand, or that we can relate to, or that we already know about. We try to kind of make sense of the things that, quite honestly, just are beyond our sensibilities. Right? Too often we make smaller this mystery of how this works, what has happened. We try to make smaller the mystery that is large and cannot be contained. It's why I think sometimes preaching about resurrection on Easter, it really is like trying to put the ocean in a bottle. Right? It's how do you do that? How do I communicate to you what resurrection, the fullness of what it means? And so, because I really can't, because it's just beyond, what we do is we try to almost subtly sort of make sense or rationalize it away. We look at a passage like this, and we kind of gather and almost proclaim that it's good news, but we don't know if it's true news. And what I mean by that is we're subtle, but we can sort of convince ourselves that in the ancient days, people didn't know as much as we know now. They didn't have the scientific awareness of the universe, of biology and chemistry and physics. They weren't as enlightened as we are today, and so they were prone to believe more things. They maybe were a little bit more gullible, a little bit more naive, and they were more apt to believe things like this. C.S. Lewis, that great Christian author, has a great phrase to describe that. He calls it chronological snobbery. Right? Just this idea that we always know more than whoever went before us. But these folks were not stupid. They understood and they had experienced that the dead stay dead. I love the story that's told of a woman who's washing her dishes. And as she's looking out the kitchen window, she sees her dog, a German Shepherd, shaking the life out of her neighbor's rabbit. And she starts to freak out. They already don't get along with their neighbors, and so she's panicking. She runs out there. She sort of gets the dog to drop the rabbit, and the dead rabbit's on the ground, and she's just freaking out at what this is going to do to this already tense relationship. And so she panics. She brings the rabbit inside. She gives it a bath. She cleans it up. She washes it. She blow dries the hair. She combs it. She fluffs it up. She sneaks back to the yard, puts it back in its cage, and then goes home like nothing happened. Hour later, she hears screams coming from her neighbor's yard, screaming, and she races over. What's wrong? And her neighbor's like, our rabbit. And she's like, what happened? And she goes, our rabbit died 2 weeks ago. We buried it, and it just showed back up in its cage. Come on. It's a cheap joke, but it's a good one. Come on, that's an Easter joke. People in the ancient world knew that dead rabbits stayed dead, and dead people stayed dead. Perhaps a quick acknowledgement of what the prevailing view of resurrection was during this time can help us, right? Because there was a prevailing view in the first century Palestine where Jesus is about what resurrection was within Judaism. And in large part, resurrection was very much a communal thing. It was something that was true of a people, right? And it was true of a people about the end of time, a future time, right? So the idea that there's this resurrection of an individual in the now was not something they could even comprehend. Like it was a we thing, not a he or a me thing. And one way of thinking about it might be, if the 49er wide receiver won the Super Bowl, we wouldn't say that a 49er wide receiver won the Super Bowl and the rest of the team didn't. Football's a team sport. The team wins a Super Bowl. And similarly, for this time, a people experienced resurrection. Resurrection is a team sport. And it's not about now, it's about then. And so what's happening here is almost outside of their imagination to comprehend what's going on. It would be something that would have surprised them. And as much as Jesus might have predicted this is what was going to happen, none of his followers said, oh, everything is going according to plan. This is exactly what we had in mind. No, in fact, what we're told is that when it becomes clear that Jesus is going to die, that all the disciples deserted him. The picture that we get in all of the Gospels is that they were in disbelief. They were disheartened, they were discouraged, they were disappointed. Until they weren't. Right? Suddenly, as a matter of historical record, this same group of people became convinced that Jesus had been resurrected, and they were motivated to spread the news at enormous risk and cost to themselves. See, it wasn't long before this community of Jesus followers came to understand that what had happened didn't just affect Jesus. The twist was the twist that nobody really saw coming. They began to understand that the age to come was already here, and that life begins while we're still alive. The community of Jesus followers were transformed through the realization that we are a resurrection people, and that resurrection truth and joy isn't a then thing only, it's a now thing as well. That the power and the hope of the empty tomb is that through the grace and the love of God, that through that grace and love, God has taken care of the then and reassured us that we're okay then, so that we can fully be freed and engaged in now, in today. And to do so without fear of judgment, without fear of being inadequate, without fear of being excluded or not being enough. Because perhaps even more significant than Jesus conquering death, as significant as that is that Jesus redeemed life. He redeemed life so that you and I can live and experience it here and now. In our passage and in our lives, what we see is that Jesus is present, walking with people, interacting with people in the ordinariness of their lives, in the normalcy of their day and who they were and what they did and how they lived. Their eyes, our eyes don't always see it. Our hearts sometimes burn. But this passage reminds us, Easter proclaims that we are a resurrection people, and that because Jesus lives, we too can live. I was thinking about how to illustrate this, and then a friend of mine earlier this week sent me a text message that had a picture of his Uber One food receipt, whatever, and a text that just said, probably a good sign and a good start to my Holy Week. Now, this is his Uber receipt, but if you look a little bit closer, what it says is, Jesus is heading your way. Look, I get it. It's Jesus. It's the driver. I get it. But I saw this and I'm like, Jesus is heading your way. And then I love that. Keep your phone nearby in case Jesus needs to reach you. Is kind of what Easter proclaims. The empty tomb shouts out that Jesus is heading our way. And because he lives, we too can live now, freed from a place of fear, confident in God's presence, assured of God's grace. Life begins when you, when we choose to see, and in seeing, experience this truth for ourselves in the ordinary normalcy of our lives. See, where the world sees death, God sees life. Where the world sees division, faith finds unity. Where the world sows despair, Jesus provides hope. Where the world sees darkness, our hearts yearn for resurrection and life. This Easter Sunday, we walk past an empty tomb. We walk past Easter miracle, and the question is what it is every day. What do you see when you look in the empty tomb? What do you see, and what does it mean to you? God forbid that we would see and not understand. God forbid that we would think the news was good but not true. Instead, may God give us eyes that see, hearts that burn, and lives that live in the reality of resurrection joy. And keep your phone nearby just in case Jesus needs to reach you. It's an important thing to remember. Friends, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Amen.